Well, the moment has arrived, as we promised, that we will be having this discussion this morning, looking at the governance and ethics issues within the public sector in particular. And there is a reason for us to set this panel up to discuss the governance framework as well as the ethical culture or lack thereof within the public sector, and look at the rules, look at the laws that govern how public servants should conduct themselves and how they should conduct their business. And we're doing this because South Africa is watching a horror movie unfold before its very self. And this has been going on for several years. It looks like and feels like, and actually the symptoms are there, that things are coming apart at local government level and within provincial government and national departments, as well as the state-owned entities. Somebody might say, I'm exaggerating the point, but then you turn around and say, well, look who's appearing before the Zondo Commission. It's like government is at the Zondo Commission, and it's not all the people who should be there, but day after day, every day, we hear about unethical and corrupt behaviors going on within the public sector. And of course, people who work for the government are not the only actors in this disappointing, demoralizing movie of corruption. There are other stakeholders. So I invited several panelists here, there are 3 of them, who can help us make sense of this, as well as hopefully look at ways and means to improve the quality of ethics within the government sector, because after all, public service is all about trust, right? The public has got to have trust in the public service. If we don't have trust, then we don't have the system. Michael Seloane is with the Public Service Commission, he's commissioner, and he will be talking to us from the point of view of what they do. Mamello Mosiana is researcher with Open Secrets, and she will be talking to us about the role of other stakeholders in driving corruption within the public sector. And I will also be talking to Dr. Claudelle Van Eck, who is an expert and coach when it comes to governance and ethical issues. So without further ado, and let me also welcome the attendees to this webinar. You're all welcome, and I'm encouraging you to raise your own questions, because I've got the 3 guests here who will be addressing those questions. Michael Seloane, right away, let me start with you. It looks like matters of trust within the public sector, whether it be politicians or it be government employees, are not taken seriously within the public sector. Why is that, you think? And what is the extent, you think, of trust or lack thereof within the public sector?
Thank you very much, Tim, and let me greet the viewers of in the webinar who will be participating. And let me start at the beginning. The beginning here, it is the Constitution. The Constitution outlines the values and principles that public administration, the whole public administration, must abide by. It establishes those values and principles in Chapter 10 of the Constitution, Section 195. Amongst those values, it's a high standard of professional ethics, the economic, efficient, and effective use of state resources, that public administration must be accountable. And in the values in Section 1 of the Constitution, it's about supremacy of the Constitution and the rule of law. That means all, whether elected officials or appointed officials, must abide by the laws of the country, in particular the supreme law, which is the Constitution. So the relationship between political and administration is a point that has been theorized for a long time. We know that Thomas Woodrow Wilson, who became the president of the US in 1912, in 1887, he was still an academic, and he theorized this issue of the relationship between officials elected and officials appointed. In the document, academic document called the Study of Administration, he was trying to show, cautioning actually, that politicians may corrupt officials, and officials may corrupt administrators. So he was cautioning that that relationship should be tightened enough and managed at all levels to ensure that there are checks and balances to make sure that officials do not corrupt elected officials and vice versa. So that's what has been theorized. And in South Africa, then we formulated the Public Service Act and the Public Finance Management Act. The Public Service Act gives the authority for the human resource functions, appointment of officials, to the executive authority, which happens to be a minister, premiers, MECs. And then the head of department should implement what the executive authority has come up with. That was a change in 1994, because before 1994, the executive authority vested with the president, and even the Public Service Commission was under the presidency. So in 1994, then there was a change that the Public Service Commission and Public Service broadly, which was lily-white, has to be transformed so that it includes people from the previously disadvantaged or those who were outside the parliament. And then in that transformation, Public Finance Management Act and the reformulated Public Service Commission Act of 1997 were put in place. And then TPSA was then established in 1996, which the Minister of Public Service and Administration became the minister responsible for transformation of the public administration as a whole. And then executive authorities became ministers of different departments who will then report to the minister all the violations within the public finance, within the public service. So Public Finance Management Act then was introduced in 2000 to give authority of managing the resources of state to the accounting officer, who happens to be the head of department or the director generals in national. So that's the framework to manage the relationship between executive authorities or ministers who are elected and officials who are not elected. But of course, what is written in law, it's written there, but officials or ministers continue to violate this relationship or the laws. And if they violate the laws, they are accountable to the law, they can be charged and then go to jail if found guilty. And then as the Public Service Commission, we promote these values and principles in the Constitution, and then we investigate, we do research on the performance of the public service in relation to the Act itself. And then we have to make sure that the public service is effective and efficient. Now, in our investigation of complaints and grievances, we found out that a number of officials keep on saying that they were given illegal instructions. And then elected officials or ministers or MECs indicate that they were ill-advised by the officials. So it's the issue of blaming one another. Officials blaming the elected officials, and then elected officials blaming the ministers. So the Public Service Commission then issued a circular to remind them of the law. And the circular indicates that if you get an illegal instruction, then you have to ask the minister to put it in writing so that you are absolved of that instruction. And alternatively, ministers have to make sure that when they receive advice, they look thoroughly at the advice and then apply their mind on it, and then can either accept it or not accept it. So, and ministers cannot claim to be ill-advised, and officials cannot claim to be given illegal instruction. So that is what needs to be dealt with. So that's the relationship between
Sure, but
elected.
what you've just said, does that apply to the state-owned entities as well, or that area, that space is governed by or according to a different set of laws and rules?
Yeah, the space of public entities and local government does not apply currently to the Public Service Commission. So Public Service Commission operates within the public service, and public service is defined as national and provincial government departments and even government components, not state-owned enterprises and not local government. We are discussing at the moment how to extend the mandate of the Public Service Commission to go towards state-owned enterprises and even to local government. So that's still a discussion in that regard.
Just another question to you and your comment. Notwithstanding all the laws and the framework that you've just explained, what is your own observation of what's going on in the public sector? Do you think that it is great, it is reasonable, it is poor, or it is shocking on the basis of the cases that you hear? And of course, people are watching, they read the newspapers, they watch television, check the news, and every day they are bombarded with a lot of wrongdoing within the public sector. As a public service commissioner yourself, are you impressed, or what's your view of what's going on within government?
I think there are varying ways of performance here. On one hand, there is high performance in terms of departments, because we can see that governance is still working. You see teachers are going to school, they're teaching, you go to hospitals, you see that doctors are there, nurses are there, although overcrowding and which is there in the schools and even in the police stations and hospitals. And then on the other hand, we have been concerned in our doing the monitoring and evaluation. We found out that there is lack of consequences. Officials are governed by the code of conduct, which is linked to the constitutional values and principles. And that some of the officials, for example, officials who have to pay service providers within 30 days, some of them are not doing that. And then there is no consequences for not doing that. And that creates a culture of lack of consequences. And then ultimately, the public service will be viewed negatively by the public. So as the Commission, doing our monitoring and evaluation, we identify these areas of weakness and then recommend what should be done to tighten those areas. Sometimes we advise ministers.
I will come back to you because, for instance, we hear of ghost workers' jobs being sold within government. We wonder how that happens, as an example, and that pensioners have got to pitch up early hours of the morning to receive their pensions. They've got to be there 3 o'clock. They never get attended to and only get attended late in the day. And so it goes. People have got to pay for this, pay for that. But those are the issues that I think some of the attendees will raise in a moment. Now, Mamello, you're a researcher, and Open Secrets has done extensive work on other role players corrupting the system. From your research and your experience and observations, who do you think are the culprits in undermining the basic ethics and governance that that should engender trust within the public sector? What is your view? What's your observation?
Well, Open Secrets' work primarily focuses on investigating private sector corruption and the way private sector enablers enable corruption both in the public sector and in their own sector. And what we find is that you can't really pinpoint one specific player in this game or in this movie, as you called it earlier. It seems to be something that is so widespread in both the public and the private sector. And what I mean by that is that in the state capture era, as we understand it, there were private sector enablers who were key to maintaining and facilitating public sector corruption. Like if we think about it, to move money across the world, as we found out that the Guptas did, or to even get money and to put it in shell companies, you need the assistance of professional services companies. These include banks, accountants, and lawyers. And what we found is that the biggest banks in South Africa, the biggest banks in the world, HSBC, played a large role in corruption at Transnet. They helped facilitate movement of money for 2 shell companies. And shell companies as well, let's think about that. They also require the facilitation or the creation by lawyers or accountants. And this is setting up companies without beneficial ownership being obvious, the obscure beneficial ownership. And we saw that companies were set up in places like Hong Kong and Dubai, which have high secrecy for companies being set up. And these companies were used by the Guptas and by public sector officials to hide money. But who was enabling that? It was the accountants, of course, and it was the consultants that were part of these deals. You saw how McKinsey enabled corruption at Eskom and even at Transnet as well, with the 1065 locomotive deal. We saw how KPMG played a role in several schemes from SARS to VBS. And we can't say that we must focus just on the public sector when we're trying to undo corruption. I think what we've seen with the arrests over the past couple of days is very exciting and very enlightening, and for a lot of people, it's very encouraging to see that there's action being taken. But if we're going to curb this kind of behavior from happening, we need for banks to act on suspicious activity reports. When a large amount of money is being moved in and out of bank accounts, and you don't know who the beneficial owner of that company is, and all of a sudden you're seeing money from public sector companies moving into countries like Hong Kong or Dubai or other places like the British Virgin Islands, which are clear tax havens, then you should be asking questions. Where is that money going? Why were the banks at like FNB and Standard Bank not asking questions of a shell company, Linkway Trading, owned by the Guptas? Why were they not tracing those transactions? And why were they not reporting them? And if they were reporting them, why did they not act? Why were those accounts not frozen? So it requires us to really imagine corruption in a very broad way. You know, we can't just say that it's the public sector that is wrong. Obviously, they are very much involved in corruption, but we also need to hold accountable private sector officials. And we're really hoping that the NPA tries to actually get some of those private sector officials also into custody and also holds them accountable. I think what we saw with the Zondo Commission a few weeks ago also enlightened us about how PwC played a role at SAA and how their role in state capture really has been detrimental to the South African public. So to answer your question in a very long-winded way, Tim, I would say that it's a very big global financial economy that enables public sector corruption. And to undo it, we really need to reconfigure and reimagine the entire space rather than just looking and focusing narrowly on public sector officials.
And what you're saying is very crucial, because if the enablers were not there, did not facilitate, then the scale of the corruption that we've seen would not have happened in South Africa. So one could say, you know, the proactively, in some instances, assisted in making sure that public money is looted in South Africa, and obviously the benefits thereof stolen from ordinary South Africans. Now, I've got one of the attendees, Michael Seloane, wants to know what the breakdown from the PSC is of the public service corruption-related cases, the outcomes and the type of violations. If you've done some statistical study to say the typical violations that you have come across as the Public Service Commission are 1, 2, 3, and the steps that you have taken, and maybe the nature of those violations, if you have such information?
Thank you very much, Tim. I may not have the details of each and every case, but we didn't do a study to look at the extent of corruption in the whole public service. So we have cases here and there which indicates corruption. But let me just show that public service is the biggest employer with close to 1.3 million people. And public service has one of the biggest budget with close to 2 trillion rands. So definitely it will attract criminals, whether in suits or otherwise, to come in, because criminals generally chase where money is. So there is a lot of money in government departments. So some of the officials who are being appointed, or some of the people who are being elected, get tempted when they see there's lots of money and then violate the laws like the Public Finance Management Act, the Public Service Act, and then creates a culture of non-accountability so that they can then find the way of
well, I suppose that, you know, and the question that I've just posed to you comes from Jean-Jacques. Let me recognize Jean-Jacques for that question. And other attendees, please send through your questions. But I think this comes from the question also is informed by the fact that we have not seen much of consequence management on the part of whether the Public Service Commission or any part of government. You know, these things get reported wherever they are reported, but not much gets done. Then people go to the public protector. Then we wait for months or even years before we hear what the recommendations from the public protector are, and or we wait for the Zondo Commission. Then we listen to the story. People wonder, why are these people not being arrested? And it's only now recently that the hawks are moving on a few cases, and then there's a bit of excitement. But one thing for sure, from the South Africans' point of view and experience, is that these things happen day in, day out. So consequence management, just to hang on to the thought, let me welcome Claudelle Van Eck, Dr. Claudelle Van Eck of Brave Inflections, who's joining us now. Welcome, Claudelle. Pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Tim.
I was just raising this question with the Commissioner Seloane there, that you know, a whole range of violations, and I want to believe I'm not exaggerating when I say that a citizen in South Africa is of the view that corruption is widespread within the government and levels of trust are very, very low, and that there's not much that's been done. From your point of view, and having done the work of holding workshops and the coaching, mentoring people when it comes to ethical issues, what is your take of the level of corruption within government, and what do you think the biggest causes of that could be? I mean, the rules are there, the governance framework is there, but the culture somehow is not there. What do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we do have a huge problem when it comes to the culture all around. Look, and we have pockets of excellence. Let's be clear about that. It's sometimes we tend to think that it is just an absolute mess everywhere. But there are a combination of factors that are contributing to what we're seeing. The biggest one that I often have to deal with that I see is fear. That a climate of fear has been created. So you don't have a speak up culture. People are afraid to come forward when they see something wrong in the organization. And that fear is real, Tim. And I think one of the things that we as South Africans need to take collective responsibility for is the fact that we are not doing enough to when it comes to whistleblowers. The protection is not good enough. The leaders are not making sure that there is protection. In the anti-intimidation and ethical practices survey results last year, we saw that amongst those surveyed, only 20% of the people strongly believed that the leaders would protect them if they were to speak up. But then they see what happened to other whistleblowers. And whistleblowing in South Africa is a very dangerous sport. You know, so if you don't protect the people, and then if they do exit the organization, a lot of those people then find it very difficult to find another job. So we don't protect them, we don't support them, we underestimate the emotional trauma that they go through, and then we don't do anything to help them to find another job. And that is the biggest one that I see come through. But there's also a significant disconnect in terms of a full comprehension of what makes up an ethical culture. People tend to think that if the leadership make the right noises and they put people through ethics training, that that is going to be enough. And it's not nearly enough, not by a long shot. So there's a lot of interventions that we need to see come through to ensure that we get to a point that we have ethical cultures. But I want to make this point, and this is that we must realize and be clear about this, that these people that we are putting the labels on as corrupt are coming from amongst us. It's our society. Our value systems have broken down. We need to look at how do we recruit people into organizations? How do we induct them into organizations? And how do we make sure that there's an alignment in their understanding of what we're expecting in terms of values and ethics? And a key thing around ethics is your ability to empathize with others. The reason why a lot of people can so easily commit fraud and corruption is because it's very difficult for some people to make that connection between the ripple effect of what they're doing. So they just see what they're doing here. They don't see the ripple. And that's one of the things we've gone wrong in society, is over time, we've lost the ability to see ourselves interconnected as part of a collective and how our actions affect others. So we need to get back to African humanism. So if we talk about Ubuntu and the true meaning of that, is that understanding that if I take something from Tim, I'm not just involving Tim and I here. There's a ripple behind Tim as well, and there are other people who get hurt in the process. Unless we get to that point where we have that deep understanding, I think we're fighting a battle in the wrong direction.
Well, you mentioned something about pockets of excellence, and I think those people must be commended, because we wonder how they manage to continue excelling in their positions and ensuring that the trust in the system is upheld. And one wonders the kinds of pressures that they work under. I remember reading a report not so long ago which said about 80 around 80 directors general had to leave their jobs or were put under pressure to leave. And that was between 2010 and 2015, I think. 82 directors general. Michael Seloane, can you confirm that there was a time when directors general did not last for a year or so, that somehow they were kicked out? And when you go back and check what they were kicked out for, I think we will begin to appreciate the political interference that also encouraged the culture that we are talking about today.
Thank you, Tim. The contracts for directors general is usually 5 years. And a number of directors general were removed for a variety of reasons. Non-performance, or maybe that the elected official did not want that director general and wanted somebody else. So in 2015, we did a study to check how long the directors general stay within the public service. And then we found that instead of them staying 5 years, as the contract indicates, they stayed about 2.7 years. And then we did that study again in 2016 and found out that it is going up to 2.9 years. So as maybe if we do another study currently, we may find that it has gone up. So those directors general who are found wanting in terms of implementation of the laws are now being charged and found guilty. I think you have seen in the mass media the battle between directors general and the ministers that is going on. And then with respect to other consequence management, the Public Service Commission has been managing the financial disclosure framework, where all senior officials in government departments, directors upwards, directors, chief directors, deputy directors general, and directors general, they have to disclose their financial interests. And then in our studies of this, we found that a number of officials were conducting business with the state. And then we recommended that officials must be barred from conducting business with the state. And then Public Administration Management Act, which was enacted in 2014, only became in force last year, where it makes conducting business with the state a criminal offense. And the minister, in the last 2-3 months, indicated that more than 1,500 officials who were found to be conducting business with the state have been criminally charged. So it shows that now, bit by bit, consequences are being felt. And we have seen in the last weeks or two that NPA is now arresting people who have been found, whose hands were found.
Dr. Seloane, let me just interrupt you there, but I appreciate what the laws are doing and some of the actions that are being taken there. But it appears to me and many other people that politicians understand this differently. Only this week, we've heard from some of them saying that they believe that it's correct that politicians and government officials should do business with the government. They actually are saying they discussed this over the weekend and pulled back and say they actually do not think it must be criminalized. So people who follow these things are thinking to themselves, yay, great, we're now going to make money out of the government. And there are cases which serve as examples. In this instance, take the Ppe Scandal, right? It's government officials who got involved in there, much as you mentioned the law that was passed that bars officials from doing that. But nevertheless, people went ahead and made sure that they formed companies to take advantage of the expenditure that they knew was going to come on stream. And there are many instances where government officials obviously would have this information ahead of everybody else, and in collaboration with other partners outside the government will set up these companies and take advantage of the government, and in the process not even deliver, as we have seen. Why is that, you think?
Yeah, well, the law is there. That's why we usually say whatever is covered in the law, it's easier said than done. However, when we tighten prosecution and that people are arrested, so that means they will conduct business with the state at their own risk. And then the law enforcement agencies will pick them up because it is covered there that it is a criminal offense for both elected officials and appointed officials. It is illegal. So they will have to account in courts of law about their conducting business with the state.
And of course, we will depend on
allowed.
Yeah.
I'm saying if this matter is allowed for officials to conduct business with the state, it will create a serious conflict of interest. Because the people
I appreciate what you are saying. I'm saying the politicians who are running the system think differently about the very matter, and they're not thinking differently privately. They're doing so publicly. It's in the news media, as we all know. Mamello, what's your view of this?
I think it goes back exactly to what Claudelle was saying, right? Is that people don't see themselves as playing a very big role on or having an effect on everyone else's life or the economy in general. I think what happens is that you see individuals acting in their private capacity as administrators or acting in their capacity as what we saw in the private sector, where you have junior auditors or auditors working for companies like KPMG, and they don't really configure or see themselves as part of a bigger system that impacts everyone else around them. What they think is the bottom line. They're thinking about the profits for KPMG. They're thinking about how to further the interests of the company. But what really is at the heart of this is that they should be working in the interest of the public. They're not supposed to be working for their own selfish interests about getting promoted. They shouldn't be working in the interest of securing contracts for their companies. They should be working in the public interest. What their work with state-owned enterprises entails is that you are serving the public, even though you are in the private sector. What that means is that you have contracted, you are now contracted to be part of the public service. And beyond that, you should be serving the public as well. And I think that that is something we find that is lacking completely in the private sector, is that the private sector sees itself as outside of its constitutional obligations and the obligations to really secure development in this country. They really see themselves as working for their shareholders, for their bottom lines or whatever. But what we see is that the public sector is changing. A lot of the contracts that are, a lot of the procurement processes that are doled out and they're given out to private sector players. So you have private sector players actually playing a very key part in public sector roles, but they don't see themselves as part of the public service. What they see themselves as is part of their companies. But that does not work, because at the end of the day, you have people, you have taxpayers, you are accountable to more than just your bottom line. And I think what Claudelle says like perfectly encapsulates that, is that people are failing to see themselves beyond just their desk job or beyond just their braai hangout with, I guess, wherever they're doing their corruption.
Louis Kruger says, first level of engagement for the majority of civil society with government is at local level. And it is at the level of local government that the people experience the worst chaos, and wants to know why local government falls out of the scope of the commission. A brief response from you, Michael Seloane.
Yeah. Yes, it is true that the interface between government and the people happens much at local government level. And at that level, that's where a lot of resources are being wasted or are siphoned to individuals. I think 1996 framework in the Constitution, left out local government out of the public service, which was the understanding at that level. So maybe there is a need to establish a single public service which includes both public entities and local government. And that is a discussion that is taking place so that we can attend to accountability of local government, provincial government, and national government at that level. So that discussion and debate is going on, led by the Minister of Public Service and Administration.
And hopefully it will be resolved very soon, because it's like an emergency situation from what people have seen. I mean, the Auditor General tells us year after year that billions and billions of rands are being wasted. So hopefully the conversation will not be drawn out. It's something that can be done within 6 months, at most 12 months, even though I suspect it's not the realization that people came to most recently. We hope it can be speeded up. I want to ask the question, Claudelle, about politicians interfering in the work of senior public officials, right? Whether they be heads of departments or they be directors general and so on, because the ministers or MECs are allowed to appoint their own officials. And then some of these officials, I'm told, and that are then deployed to interfere in the work of the different departments. How widespread do you think this practice is? That's one. And number two, one would like to believe that politicians understand all the laws and the rules that you spoke about, Michael Seloane, earlier on. But we've heard of many instances where when they come in, certain people must ship out so that the new politician or new minister, new MEC can then install their own culture and way of doing things in those particular departments. Claudelle, your comment.
Look, I think in terms of what the reports that we've seen so far, it is widespread enough for us to be really concerned about it. And And here I think it's one of those things where we need to really have a conversation around how do we train our leaders. So the fact that you are a politician does not necessarily mean automatically that you know how to lead an organization. You may know how to get people to vote for you, but not necessarily the implications when it comes to running an organization. So we need, I think, a lot more intervention at that level. But then those people who are deployed, often those people are professionals as well, who are accountable to professional bodies when it comes to the ethical conduct. And we need to ask the question there as well. If you are seeing yourself as deployed and being in service of an individual who happens to hold the title minister, what about your ethical obligations and in relation to the service to the country? Because you really, you may be reporting to the minister, but you're not working for the minister, you're working for us, the public. And that disconnect, I don't think that that enough is being done to get that in the brains of people to fully understand and comprehend the magnitude of the responsibility that comes with that leadership role. We need a lot more transparency around how that happens as well. I think if you don't have enough transparency, this is where people can do the kinds of things that we have seen in terms of bringing their own people in. I don't think there is necessarily a big problem with you bringing somebody in who you know is competent, but the person needs to be able to tick all the boxes. The problem comes in when the person is then deployed to go and make sure that the wrongdoing is increased or there's corruption and so forth. That is where your transparency needs to come in and accountability from that perspective. You can't have accountability without transparency. But for me, as I said earlier on, the key is the process that people go through when they assume a role and making sure that they fully comprehend what it means and the ripple effect of the ethical implications and the ripple effects thereof.
Well, I mean, I wonder, we're talking about these things, whether it is possible to instill an ethical culture, for instance, as well as get people who can adhere to the governance frameworks if you have a policy of cadre deployment, as an example. I'm sure it is possible, I don't know. But in that situation, you also have cronyism and nepotism taking place. On top of it, we also hear of ghost workers being on the books of government, and it appears the departments themselves do not know how many ghost workers they have on their books. And frankly, Michael Seloane, I think any South African is actually baffled how it happens that in the government it is possible to have ghost workers and government does not know how many such ghost workers are there. Whereas in any other business, it's very, 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 very rare and impossible for a company to keep paying salaries at the end of the month to people who are non-existent. But somehow it happens in government. How do you explain
that? Generally, it's called systems. Systems were weakened, or they were weak enough to be able to trace everybody who's in the system. We moved from 1994, taking over the systems of the former Bantustans and the former apartheid government and putting them together. And then in the process, there were certain people who were captured twice or whatever. So between 1996 and to date, there's been a number of assessments done by a number of departments to check that there are no ghost employees. So in some instances, people were not paid through EFT, and then they had to come and collect checks. And then in that process, thousands of employees who were ghost employees were discovered and then stopped. So it's going to be a process just to make sure that PESAL, which is the salary system of government, is cleaned and then doesn't allow any person from being captured twice. So it is a problem. And when it comes to the issue of cadre deployment, when you talk about the cadre, it's somebody who has been trained and who understands the policies, procedures, and have the techniques to implement. Cadre deployment by itself is okay, but it has been abused where people who are not cadres were appointed, who were not properly trained were appointed. And in that instance, the Public Service Commission is doing investigations and found that where there is a wrong, irregular appointment, we direct the ministers and departments to reverse those appointments. So a number of those have been implemented.
Let me go to the attendees. Bulelani Taleni says, why can't we scratch down in terms of leadership? Because the most corrupted people seem to be those in positions of leadership, whether they be ministers or MECs or heads of the department. That's right there. And Claudelle, maybe you should go first on this one.
Yeah, I think we need to also take responsibility as citizens. You know, the cycle of accountability runs and loops across, and it comes back to us. If we keep on voting people into power, and we know that there is a problem, and we then do it over and over again, you know, it's the insanity principle. So we also need to take a responsibility from that perspective, but also in terms of how we hold the leaders accountable. You know, just yesterday I sent out a tweet saying that I think that my generation may have been a lot more effective in silencing the younger generation as compared to previous generations, because if young people today were just to really understand how the leaders are robbing them of their future, we should be seeing a lot more pushback than what we are seeing right now. So the accountability really starts with us. And then we need to ask more questions about the process that the leaders go through and the accountability at that level. But leaders also need to hold each other accountable, Tim. And this is one of the things that one sees across the board, not just amongst the politicians. You see it in the leadership in private organizations. The one knows, they know that there's one that is doing something wrong. But they don't speak up, and they don't confront, and they don't pull those people out, or they close ranks. So if you look at KPMG, the initial phases when we saw the story break, there was more of a self-protectionism before you started to see the opening up. So that self-protectionism and closing ranks is what really makes sure that the wound festers and the poison spreads.
Michael Seloane, just a brief comment from you. We have heard, thanks to the Zondo Commission, that some of the senior officials of government were holding their meetings at the Gupta household, for instance, and were even part of WhatsApp groups with the Guptas discussing government business, as well as the awarding of contracts and appointment of people. In a way, it rendered, and I say this respectfully, to you as the Commissioner of the Public Service Commission, it undermines your existence as a commission, because your responsibilities were supplanted, were taken over by the Guptas at one point. When you read what we read, what do you think? How do you feel about the fact that, irrespective of the laws that you have mentioned and the professional ethical culture that you are trying to build within the government, another entity elsewhere, and Mamello, you should follow up with your comment on this one, whatever you were doing was being undermined elsewhere. How do you feel? Or speaking on behalf of the PSC, a very brief response from you.
I think what we need to do is to tighten the system of accountability. Because once the public is not vigilant about their the use of their money, which is the taxes, officials are going to take advantage of that. And then we've seen that also in the Zondo Commission, that parliamentarians were also found wanting in terms of accountability. So the system of accountability is that the public elects the parliament, and then parliaments elects the executive, and the executive must be accountable to parliament, and parliament must be accountable to the people as a whole. But in between the 5 years, it becomes very difficult for the public to hold the parliament accountable. And that's why they have to use even the courts, and the courts, which might be a little bit expensive, but they can go in there and interpret the law and force government to work in a particular way. So I think our role should be understood together with those of members of the public. And that's why we're making our reports public, so as to make the members of the public conscious of how their resources are being used, so that they can hold the executive.
Okay, let's pause right there. Mashao Rasebotsa says it is the norm, commonly accepted, it appears these days, that before you get awarded a tender, you've got to pay some kickbacks to the top officials. There's talk of lifestyle audits, but they never get done. We've heard so much about them, but there's never been a report published that says here are the results of the lifestyle audit. I'm not sure if the Public Service Commission is responsible for that. You can comment to that later on. And Oratile Tlhabane says the punitive fines levied on private institutional enablers, are they sufficient? The question is, how else can these private institutions be held accountable? And Vanessa Calendar says people cannot stop these high-level crooks, as we all can see, because these are sophisticated things and they only come to light late in the day, as it is becoming apparent now. We are just about to conclude. Mamello, I want to start with you, your comments to the 3 points that were raised.
I think one of the first things I'm going to address is the fact that penalties for the private sector are not nearly enough. I think accountability is should be the primary focus right now. We are at a crisis point, and we're seeing that the private sector is almost getting away with not even answering for their role in state capture at all. They've been completely left out of the stories of state capture. And what is happening is that this is going to continue happening because their cultures, the institutional cultures of the way they carry out their work is not being challenged, and it's not going to change. We are not seeing individual CEOs being brought to account. And there's certainly a case for individuals from private sector companies to be brought to account. I think we've seen with KPMG's particular auditors, senior auditors, who were involved in these corruption schemes. And what we're seeing also at companies like McKinsey, we saw Vika Sagar. He was let go without ever having any penalties. He was let go with his full benefits or whatever. And that means that what you see is that it just says, well, good on you, you've done your corruption, but we're not going to change as an institution. We're just going to pay our fine, which is very little when you think about the kinds of profits that these companies are making, which are in the billions. And really what you see is just a culture that's ingrained and it's continuing to happen. But it's not, as one of the questions that came out, it's not something that can only be discovered at the end. I think what we should be doing is we should have open procurement processes. Government should be forced to actually publish how they're giving out tenders. We should have a system online where we can see that as it is happening. And then we should also have companies disclose their beneficial ownership. You cannot be setting up a company in Malta and not telling us who owns that company as a lawyer. And as banks, why are banks not stopping transactions that they don't understand? Why are they letting billions of dollars flow from public sector companies? Like when Eskom is releasing 5 billion to one individual or one individual company, you should be asking questions. And that means what I'm saying is essentially that the entire system needs to ask questions of itself.
Michael Seloane, You explained to us how things are supposed to work, but clearly you've got a lot on your hands. What else can you do, and how far are you down the line in, as you can hear and we can read and we can see, a lot of problems within the public sector. What else can you do? A brief response from you.
Yeah, Tim, as our work continues, we promote the values and principles. So through talking, through studies, through research, through investigation, that's the work that we continue doing. And we make recommendations, we make advices to ministers, and we direct them with respect to appointments, that they reverse irregular appointments so that they can be dealt with. With respect to lifestyle audits, already the Public Service Commission is doing much of the work, in the sense that on annual basis, it looks at the issue, the disclosure in terms of companies, in terms of properties, in terms of movable properties like cars, whatever. Because we can see all those properties, we are able to give the findings and see that an official is earning this amount of money, but the lifestyle, the companies that this official has, the properties that this official has, is not commensurate to the salary.
Have you ever charged or
can contribute much to the lifestyle?
Have you ever charged or dismissed somebody for violating the lifestyle audits, or on the basis of the lifestyle audits, you concluded that this person should not be in the employ of the public service?
You remember a team at the beginning I indicated about executive authority. That executive authority is ministers and departments. So we recommend to the executive authorities which officials to be charged. And then over the past years, several of the officials were charged and then warned or even given final written warnings, and some of them were even dismissed from the public service as a result of recommendations that were made.
All
so
right.
in the last few years,
yes. But do you have any oversight on politicians, on ministers that you think on the basis of lifestyle audits should be dismissed from their positions?
Unfortunately not. That is the role of the public protector. We only look at the appointed officials.
All right. And Claudelle, we are concluding. What else can we do? The frustrations are there. The hawks can only do so much. As people like to say, that South Africa is like a crime scene, especially within government circles, and it's not something to be proud of. Even conducting this interview, I wish I could talk about some great things that are going on, and of course we agree there are some pockets of excellence within the public sector, but generally speaking, it's like, we've got a system that's not working the way it should, but it can be improved. Where can we start? What can we do, Claudelle, briefly?
I think we really need to make a concerted effort around interventions to make sure that if people understand the ethics and instill that in ethics. When it comes to the culture of the organization, internal audit should have the audit of culture very clearly on the audit plan, so that you can start to work on the finding and the recommendations coming through from there. So your insurance providers really can play a significant role in bringing the issues to the fore, the root causes that the organization needs to address. And just lastly, to the point that Mamello made around the private sector companies, those that are complicit in the corruption that you see in the public sector, absolutely agree. We don't have enough consequences there, but you should be able to go further than a fine. You can do things like mandate a culture assessment, and that they need that there needs to be consequences within the organization. They need to report to us, the public, in terms of what they've done and how they've turned things around and clean out.
Yeah, well, very, very compelling, interesting conversation we're having, and I suppose we're all playing our civic duty here, making sure that we make sense of a mess that has been growing in South Africa that undermines the interests of citizens and the sustainability of our democracy and the well-being of our nation. Michael Seloane, thank you very much. Mamello Mosiana, thank you very much. Dr. Claudelle Van Eck, thank you. Jean-Jacques wants to thank you too. One of the attendees saying, a great webinar, much appreciated. And I also appreciated your presence and your thoughts that you shared with us. And to the attendees, thanks for being part of this webinar, as well as your inputs and questions. You all have a great day. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and bye-bye. But the more transparent we become, the more we are able to see